Hello, I would like to welcome you, PJ Smith, and you are the Director of Fashion Policy at Humane World for Animals. And lest people think that the people that they know that work for the Humane Society of the US have all gone and gotten different jobs in the last 3 weeks or so. You can tell me, I think you've got HSUS has rebranded.
Correct, correct. As of, I think it was Valentine's Day, we're now both Humane Society of the United States and Humane Society International has rebranded as Humane World for Animals. So I forget it sometimes when I'm introducing myself because I've been, working at the Humane Society of the United States for 15 years, and I'm very happy that you introduced me correctly because I probably would have forgotten. But yes, Humane World for Animals.
Well, you might have noticed I was looking down at my cheat sheet. Soon it will fall out of
Exactly.
my mouth like nothing. And you are the director of fashion policy. Is that as exciting and celebrity filled as it sounds?
You know what? I don't know if it's ever touched on the celebrity side of things, but it has touched on the fashion side of things where like I said, I've been doing this for about 15 years, and a lot of that originally was working with fashion brands and designers and retailers to educate them about the fur trade. And so if I've had some amazing opportunities to sit down with some big fashion icons in my life and talk about fur and the cruelty and things like that. So it's sometimes I get to put on a suit or a tux and go to a fun event, but those are pretty rare.
Well, let me ask you, do you get all nervous about what you're going to wear when you're sitting down with some big name fashion designer? I know I would be
Yeah,
looking through my closet. Oh, what can I wear?
I mean, I there was one time, and it's one of those things where I think other people that know how to work the system, they know how to ask a designer, being like, "I'm gonna go to this event. Will you dress me?" kind of things. And I've never been that kind of person to even think that was an option. But one time I was going to England and I was about to announce Elle Magazine's fur free policy at a very prestigious event, and I was meeting with Stella McCartney and her team like the couple days before, and I asked her, and I was like, you would never dress me for something like this. And somebody immediately came in, took my measurements, and they're like, we'll have something to your hotel like later that
Oh,
day. And so, in full disclosure, I did not get to keep it. I had to send it right back. But I started getting nervous because Stella McCartney's very like gender neutral with her clothing. Mostly, I don't even know if she has a men's line. But I started like looking up celebrities wearing Stella McCartney, and it was like that Timothy Chalamet, and or, I
mm.
don't know if I'm saying it right, but it was. I started seeing the suits, and they were all very like some of them were like capri pants or very tight, and I started getting very nervous because I was like, Timothy Chalamet can pull that off, but PJ Smith might not be able to. I was so grateful when I actually opened the bag. It was just a regular blue suit, a Stella McCartney blue suit that I got to wear on stage. So that was one of the highlights of my dressing for these events and for fashion.
Oh, that sounds really cool. That's one of the stories you can always tell people
Sure.
because it's pretty unique. So, what we're going to do is talk about anti fur and related issues. And our touchstones are kind of 1995 because Attorneys for Animals is commemorating its 30th anniversary and what things were like then with regard to anti fur activism and what it's like now. Before we get started, I think one of the messages that is important to hammer home is there is no such thing as humane fur. And can
Correct.
you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Sure. Yeah. I think when it comes to fur, the species involved are generally the top species are mink, fox, raccoon dogs, and chinchillas. They make up the majority of the fur that is sold, and they come from large sort of fur factory farms, mostly in China, some in Europe, but the United States has its fair share of fur farms as well. And these specific species have been bred more for their pelt quality and coloring, and not for some sort of domestication. So they very much have their natural instincts. Are mink are semi-aquatic, so they want to be near or in water for they are in nature in the majority of their life. Foxes are dig, and so that they and run, a great distance. So they have to have access to ground and things like that. So there's something when you take a species like that has those natural behaviors and put them into a wire bottom cage for them to live their entire lives, that leads to some pretty horrible things, stereotypical behaviors, the pacing, self-mutilation, cannibalism, and they're just stressed out and scared the entire time. This is during the COVID pandemic. We were able to, putting these species that were susceptible to these zoonotic diseases, so in close counters like that, where they're stressed out, we saw the spread of these diseases throughout mink fur farms, and then avian flus. I know that on the other side, farm animal campaigns are dealing with that, but the fur trade is also dealing with foxes having avian flu. And when you put them in these, somebody gets, or a fox or mink comes down with one of these diseases, it spreads like a wildfire, because they're just not meant to be in these sort of situations and jam packed in these big fur farms and these cages. And so I think it brings a whole bunch of issues similar to other factory farming issues, where you have waste runoff and environmental concerns, but the cruelty is always top of mind when he talks about putting these specific species, foxes, mink, raccoon dogs, in these small cages. And so there's just no way to do it humanely, and probably profit from it. So that's why fur industry, all their regulations or standards, which are self-imposed, are done to keep the pelt quality and to keep things cheap.
You see that across the board with animal use industries. They want to self-police, and they sometimes get an opportunity to do this. So your goal is to see an end to, well, let me ask you, have
Yeah.
you say what your goal is.
Yes, our goal is to see the end of the fur trade. And I mean, there's some lessons that we learn. If you want to start jumping right into the 80s and 90s, I'm happy
Sure.
to. Yeah, so um, I think it's an interesting campaign in the sense that, well, first I want to say congratulations to Attorneys for Animals and its 30th anniversary. That's quite an
Thank
achievement.
you.
That's awesome. So, but looking back at the fur issue, I mean, it's been a contentious issue going back decades. And you go back to those 80s and 90s, in particular, it was really driven in the US and the UK by, aggressive campaigning, where you had the billboards, I'd rather go naked. You had the protests going on. And then in the UK, you had Farm Aid, where a lot of these celebrities like Chrissy Hine and stuff were coming out in very against the fur trade. And what sort of happened was that, it was effective in the sense that it created this sort of feeling of fur being taboo, where people were scared to wear it, because they thought it was going to get some sort of reaction. Um, and sales went down, the imports went down, so it was an effective campaign. The thing that I think was the really interesting part of that was during that around, I think it was 94, 95, it was when Calvin Klein went for free. And, that was a big designer at the time, and making a statement like that, where I think there was maybe like Anne Klein followed suit, or Kate Spade. I'd have to look back real quick, but that was it though. When it came to any sort of public or corporate policy, was this one announcement um, by Calvin Klein that really made headlines. And there really wasn't any sort of domino effect that happened after that.
Can
And
I
so,
ask,
yeah.
how did that happen? Did someone with a animal group approach him, or did he just wake up one day and see the light?
Yeah,
Or do you know?
I don't know. I mean, that very well could have been a PETA reaching out to them kind of thing. I would have to look back. There is, like, you can search, and there's an old like New York Times article from '94, where it talks about that. But I can't remember that top of mind. But um, at least here in the United States, it was taboo. A lot of people, a lot of campaigners, I think, sort of thought we won, because it was this idea that it was taboo. It was, people were avoiding fur, and you just weren't seeing it as much, outside of, maybe the random celebrity or something. But here in the US, I think around 2000, what happened was it led to the Dog and Cat Protection Act, which is a little different, but it touched on the fur trade, in the sense that it stopped imports of dog and cat fur, because there was a lot of that still being imported into the United States. Those old like cat sleeping figurines, my grandmother had one. I remember doing some tests on, or we did tests on those, and it discovered that that was actually cat fur and that was actually dog fur. So really hard to believe, but that was what was happening in the United States. In the UK, they were the first country in 2000 to ban fur production. So that was, all the momentum there carried them to actual production ban, which is pretty significant because they were the first. But around, 2004, 2005 is when, two things happened that I think were pretty relevant. The first was the China was starting to have economic prosperity, because of some trade deals, and uh, they had a thirst for luxury items, and part of that was fur. And also around that time, there were two organizations, Swiss Animal Protection and East International, that went to fur markets in China and documented a species called a raccoon dog being skinned alive. And this was, I've heard of people going vegan because they saw this, and it finally made it click of like the horrible ways that we treat animals. And so I know at the Humane Society of the United States at that time, we started seeing, fur sales going up. We started seeing fur imports going up, and we started seeing fur on the runways starting around 2005, 2006. And in that raccoon dog footage, I think it really put us on a direction of what is this species? How is it coming into the United States? It's called a raccoon dog. And we started looking at some of the labeling laws that were involved with how fur was sold in the United States. And when we were looking at this one specific species, raccoon dog, we were seeing labeling labels and advertising say raccoon, Asiatic raccoon, Murmanski, Tanuki. These were all trade names, for this one species. that was being sold around the world. But here in the United States, we started seeing this specific species being sold as faux fur a lot. And we started doing some digging and realized that there was a loophole in the federal law that said that if the value of the fur was less than $150, it didn't have to be on the label or in the advertisement, the actual species or country of origin. And so we started trying to work with different government agencies, the FTC, to show them that this is a real problem, that consumers were being duped into buying real fur, thinking that they were buying faux fur. And in 2010, after several investigations, President Obama signed the Truth in Fur Labeling Act, which closed that loophole in the federal law that said all fur had to be labeled with the country of origin and species. Pretty simple, but that's what was needed for consumers to know what they were buying. And I will say, just
That
on
seems like, excuse me, that seems like it would be very significant because I think there were probably that loophole was probably a very big loophole because little items, gloves or
yeah,
muffs, head muffs or something could have just a little bit of fur and people would unwittingly buy it.
for sure. Yeah, the law is actually the fur products labeling law is from the 1950s. And I think the fur like jackets were more prominent, not necessarily the trim and things like that. So it was originally set up to, stop companies from making up species, and so it gave like a very clear name guide, because I think at that point they were calling like um they would sell like rat fur and they'd call it river mink or something like that, and so it tried to bring some clarity and transparency to it, but it left that loophole, which again, as you stated, like trim was what was popular, palms on hats that was popular, and that kind of stuff is like pennies, dollars, and so it definitely falls with under the $150 loophole. But I can say, like, what was really helpful, not only were we able to change a federal law to make sure consumers had more information, but we were also able to get our foot in the door with a lot of companies that were selling fur, and were selling a lot of fur at that time. And I think when we approached them, we were not going in there to say, you need to go for free. It was something that they got desensitized to them, because other organizations were, go for free, go for free. And they kind of got immune to those requests, but they were still making a lot of money. And so when we were able to work with them, we were saying like, okay, we would love for you to go for free, but in the meantime, you should be, making sure your consumers have all the right information. We can help with the labeling and advertising, and and I think as a first step, you should get rid of raccoon dog fur, just because it's this one, it's associated with live skinning. It's also associated with being the most like um, falsely advertised fur on the market. And we got a lot of interest there, where a lot of these brands that previously weren't willing to talk about the issue were saying, okay, well, we agree, well. And so we would get our foot in the door, and after that we would educate them on more of the fur, because a lot of them would just ask, do you have humane sources for fur? And we would say, well, let's go see. And we would go through every species, and sometimes I remember there were designers that would say, well, we're going to go to a fur farm ourselves and see. And those are probably going to be the nicest fur farms out there too. They're going to be the maintained ones in Finland and the show farm. But still, I think they were coming back and saying they weren't sure they wanted to be associated with that. And so we were able to lay out the risks of being associated with animal cruelty, and we were also seeing this change happen on sustainability, where all these companies wanted to be more sustainable, and we saw this growing interest amongst consumers, that they wanted clothing that was ethical, like, and sustainable. And so suddenly these brands that were so quiet about the issue were suddenly wanting to scream from the mountaintops that they were fur free. And we were at the right time at the right place to work with a lot of these brands, the Gucci's, the Michael Kors, the Armani's, where we were having these conversations, and we were able to just say, okay, let's make this announcement. And I can tell you, going back to this, all started happening around 2015. So you finally had the Truth in Fur Labeling Act 2009, or went into effect in 2013. 2015 is when these companies started announcing their fur-free policies. And it was consistent and constant from 2015 through almost today, where we've had a big fur-free announcement every quarter almost. I will say it's getting tougher because the companies that there aren't many left. You know, all the US retailers are now fur free. Most of the big international brands are now fur free. And so that was, you know, that was really successful. But the ones like the LVMH, the Louis Vuittons, the Fendis, they've really dug in their heels, and they've sided with the fur trade. So it's going to be really difficult to, you know, convince those last remaining companies to go for free. But we're the cool thing, and just to see how this campaign has evolved from the 90s to where we are today, is understanding the importance of policy, either corporate policy or public policy. So once we have all these brands going for free, we were then able to go to legislators and say, you know, consumers don't want this product because it's associated with cruelty, and all the companies are for free. So we should start banning the sale. We should start banning the production of this. And so we can really end the fur trade. And that's kind of where we are today, where we have over 20 countries, mostly in Europe, that have banned fur production because of cruelty. A lot of it was because of the pandemic and realizing the risks of zoonotic diseases. And then here in the United States in 2019, California banned fur sales. And a lot of people always are like, well, California doesn't probably wear a lot of fur. California was by far the largest seller of fur in the United States. It's just a huge economy. I think it's the number one state, but with New York and California, it's nearly half of all the fur sold in the United States are in those two states. So, you know, it was activists that were on the ground in LA, San Francisco, Berkeley, West Hollywood that started getting momentum with these fur sales bans that led to California banning fur sales in 2019. It went into effect in 2023, and several cities have introduced, you know, their own fur sales bans, like 7 cities in Massachusetts, Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I think that there's going to be several more trickling in. But that's really the focus here in the United States, is getting some of these fur sales bans, which just, you know, it addresses the demand for these fur products, because we ultimately, you know, to end this trade, we kind of just have to um, you know, decrease the value of a fur pelt by only a few dollars. And that's the difference between a fur farmer making millions of dollars or losing millions of dollars. And we're at that point now where it's just not economically viable for a lot of these farmers to stay in business. So they're transitioning to other areas, and that's what we're seeing with furriers here in the United States. We're now seeing countries like the UK and Switzerland. They're currently looking at banning fur imports. They don't have any fur production, so they can say, well, we just don't even want it to, we don't even want to be part of that global trade because of all the cruelty involved with it. And so that's just going to keep on chipping away at the fur trade, where I can comfortably say at this point that we'll be able to see the end of this trade, at least, you know, for the masses in the western part of the world. It's going to be the end. I don't know how we're going to tackle, you know, Russia quite yet. There's still a lot of fur sales there, still a lot of fur sales in China. But knowing that China was very much connected to the brands, the luxury brands, and now that they are all mostly fur free, that helps us there as well. But as you stated, like that before we started recording, was that fashion cyclical. So now we have to start thinking about, okay, what is so if fur going to come back, and how do we prevent that from happening? That's why these corporate policies are super important. That's why these public policies for sales, for production bans are important. But we need like the Vogues, and we need the New York Fashion Weeks to take a stand on this. A lot of financial institutions have fur-free policies where they will no longer fund the fur trade. So all those things will make it really difficult for animal fur to come back as an acceptable trend. But, and this is where we are today, and I think it's really interesting, is looking at the nuances of, if you remove animal fur, you're left with vintage or used fur or faux fur, and or shearling, which is lamb's fur. And that's kind of like what's happening at Fashion Week, this last Fashion Week in New York, Paris, Milan, and London, where we started seeing that fur look coming back, but it wasn't foxes, wasn't mink or raccoon dogs. It was either faux fur, or it was a lot of times shearling. So it is something that we want to keep an eye on, because shearling, we don't want just one cruelty to move to another species. But I mean, that is the impact of this work so far. So we've taken a step in the right direction. For a lot of these fashion brands, they had never had an animal welfare policy until they went for free. And then they can add on to it. So then now they are wanting to ban exotic skins. Now they're feeling the pressure to do something about the environmental impact of leather and some of these other materials, where hopefully there's going to be more resources being pumped into innovation than ever before. So we're going to start seeing really quality alternatives that brands are comfortable about working with. For faux fur, for example, it wasn't great for the environment, but because we were able to create a demand, a gap in that market for not just animal-free fur, but also plastic-free fur, we've now seen at least 4 or 5 companies emerge as plant-based faux fur. So no plastic, no animals, and it has the same look and feel. And so it's cool to see how the innovation part of it also plays into, if a designer really wants that look and that feel, they have an option now that isn't necessarily tied to animal suffering. So that was, in a very short amount of time, the history from the 90s to today of where we are. But in the last 10 years, the fur trade has dropped 85%, from killing 140 million animals every year to 2023, they killed just around 20 million, solely for the fur trade, those same species I mentioned
Is this
before.
worldwide?
Yep.
How much
And
of
so
that is in the US, do you know?
So US is still pretty small. Like I said, it's mostly China and Europe, but if Europe, and they are considering a full out ban of fur production, and we should hear some next steps on that this summer. The United States could very well become the second or third largest fur producer in the world after China very, very quickly, as soon as the EU gets out of that. So I think that's something, and I'll say there is a federal bill that would ban mink production here in the United
The Mink
States.
Act or something
Yeah,
like.
but it's a buyout, so that the fur farmers would take home some money. And I think that's a non-starter for a lot of legislators, where they're just like, we're not going to put a dime into it. But I think it's, other countries, we see them doing these buyouts, and I think it's potentially the best route for us to go here in the US, to eventually getting, at least mink farming banned.
That there was a bill last session, and it was in the farmed animal issue area, and it it was introduced by Senator Booker, who is a very strong animal advocate, especially farmed animal issues. And I mean, it was a sort of a pie in the sky, and it would have wound down industrial ag. I think it was maybe in 15 or 20 years.
Mhm.
But one component of that was to reimburse some of the farmers who, probably mainly the contract farmers, who worked for the huge industrial ag corporation. So that is a model.
Mhm.
Um, and
Yeah.
probably the fur bill would have more chance than the industrial ag wind down would.
You
But
never know. I do say, I mean, knowing like Norway just finally, banned all of their fur farms because the farmers took the buyout. And
hmm,
so there's officially no more fur farms there. And we're seeing this, across the board in Europe. So it does give me hope that, maybe at one point we'll start recognizing that the United States is a player in the fur trade. I mean, we haven't talked much about trapping, but the United States and Canada are the top two trapping countries in the world. I can say like it was interesting that Canada Goose was the company that everyone wanted to go for free for a while, and when they did, the prices of coyote pelts at the auctions, the trapper auctions, they dropped significantly because Canada Goose wasn't buying them. And so that's, it's good because at this point trapping, pelt prices are low, where it's almost not, it's no one's making a living off of it anymore. So they're saying it's mostly just like a pastime, that keeping, tradition alive. But I don't see many of the kids out there wanting to be part of that. And the same is happening when you think about the furriers. It's a lot of times that these were generational retailers here in the United States, and the kids want nothing to do with it. So they're closing up their fur shops for good. And so I think it's a changed consumer that cares more about these issues because they are able to see it. It wasn't until that 2005 investigation where you saw a live skinning of a raccoon dog, and it started to finally make connection of like, oh, this is where fur comes from. And we do every year, I think, going back to 2015, we do an investigation, undercover investigation, in either China or Finland. We just were asked in Ohio the county of Ashtabula asked us to come on to a fur farm in Ohio, because the owner had died over the holidays and they did not know what to do with the hundreds of foxes and coyotes, and he had skunks. And I can tell you it was some of the worst stuff that I've ever seen going on to that farm. And, there were animals missing limbs, and it was the filth of it and the smell of it. I'll never forget that. But that's the reality of fur farms. It's just like those species and those environments is just going to always be hell on earth. And so I'm confident that just like the more transparent, the more people see that, and make that connection, then they're not going to want anything to do with that trade. And so that's kind of, we're almost there. But I will say again, going back to the 80s and 90s, if we should have learned anything, is that you can't give up. It's
mhm.
going to be more difficult now to get those remaining brands to go for free. It's going to be really difficult to pass the legislation that's needed to ensure that fur will never come back. And we're pretty dedicated to making that happen. And that there's a large coalition of animal groups that are part, and all want to see the same thing. So I'm encouraged, but I also know it's going to be a lot of work. So we can't say that we won, not like the 90s.
Hmm. So, a couple questions. First of all, I know that there's an international alliance, Fur Free Alliance, and you're part of that.
Yeah.
And I remember I was looking at that and I thought it was interesting. They had the three components of the campaign, which was the consumer, the corporate, and the political. And I think you've kind of touched on all of those, and it's important. Um,
Yeah. For sure. Yes.
Then,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, no, you go ahead.
No, I was
I
just
was
gonna
going to
say,
go off onto another topic, so you go
yeah,
ahead.
it's called the Fur Free Alliance. It's like a coalition of almost 50 organizations from like 30 countries, and it's so cool to like be in a room and all talking about, there's people there from the 90s that have been working on
Mm.
this issue, and the amount of knowledge of the activists in that room on the fur issue is immense. And so it's so fun to just like get together with them and hear, okay, what are we doing in Poland? What are we doing in Germany? Like all these countries have a strategy to move away from the fur trade. And yeah, you touched on it. Like it's very clear that the three things that are the most important are getting those companies to go for free, getting these production and sales bans passed, and then making sure the consumers are always aware that this is happening. So that's where those investigations come in, to just always be able to see inside what these fur farms look like, because the moment we don't, they start saying, "Oh, it's humane" or something like that. And it's just not
Mm.
true. Nothing has changed from the 80s and 90s from the fur trade. They still raise the animals in horrible, horrible ways.
Which is, as we said at the top of this, that's by definition. They can't change how they raise them.
Hmm.
There was no breakthrough that suddenly made it humane.
There was one time when the Germany passed a law. So Germany doesn't have a outright ban on fur production. One of the few countries that doesn't. They had a few fur farms, and they passed a law several years ago now that just said, okay, mink have to have an area to swim, foxes have to have an area to dig. That's the regulation that they passed, and fur farming industry left within that year, because by giving animals a little bit of what is natural to them immediately made it economically not viable. And so I always think that's such an interesting thing. It's
Hmm.
like they'll never be able to do it and make money off of it. So that's why they have to do these large caged operations, because it's the only way they can make money. So I think there's something to learn there.
Interesting. I wanted to go back to the example you gave over the holidays, the person in Ohio. What happened to those animals? And I mean, some probably had to be euthanized. Can they be released into the wild? I know that one of the claims, and this goes back to the 90s, where there were more, I think it was like Animal Liberation Front and
Hmm.
other groups would go to fur farms and release the animals, and the the pushback from the industry was, well, that's cruel because uh, they can't survive in the wild because they've been farmed. So could you answer that specific question and talk about what would happen to animals who had been in fur farms?
Yeah. Well, I would say, I mean, it's so rare that we were able to be invited onto a fur farm. It's there, there's around 100 mink farms. We don't know where the fox farms are. They're unregulated, and so there's just no way of knowing exactly where they
But
are or how many there
the
are.
mink farms are regulated?
No, so there is a survey that goes out from the USDA. It's not mandatory. So we kind of know that there's around 100 mink farms because of that, but we don't know where, or they're just not regulated in any other way except for this survey. So no regulation. They don't fall under any Humane Animal Welfare Act. They don't fall under Humane Slaughter Act. You can literally do whatever you want and treat these
Mm.
animals. But the Ohio situation, out of the 400 or 400 animals that were on this farm, we were able to place 330 of them at different wildlife sanctuaries across the US, because they had to have the right environment, they had to have the right space, and it was quite an endeavor. But our animal rescue team was on the ground for weeks in 10-degree weather and off of Lake Erie, taking care of these animals until they could get placed. And there were some that had to be euthanized. Like I said, this particular fur farm, I think he was nervous about animals getting out of the cages, and so he aligned the sheds with leg hold traps. And so when we were actually like going into the sheds for the first time, there were actually like coyotes out of their cages in the leg hold traps and still alive, and so with missing limbs. And so a lot of those animals did have to be euthanized. But to be able to actually go onto a farm, see what they look like, and be able to place some of those animals, I think we'll be able to do follow-ups and see how these foxes and coyotes are doing in more natural environments, which is such a rare thing. But as far as it's not something that we would recommend, letting animals out of farms. Primarily, I know that, when mink, they're quite aggressive carnivores, and they will, when they get out, they will probably go and kill anything within striking distance. So they will wreak havoc on the wildlife, and if there's a chicken coop in that area, those chickens are going to be killed pretty quickly. So, and I know some of them don't survive. I do think that there is a lot of these farmers, it's that last thing where they're like already not wanting to be in that industry. So when somebody lets the animals out of the cages, they suddenly are like, I don't think it's worth doing this anymore. So we have seen some fur farms close as a result of letting animals out. But yeah, I think we have to still look at this as a very global trade. And if the demand is there, those animals are going to die. And so we want to make sure that that demand is gone. And that's by getting companies to go fur free. That's by getting cities, states, and countries to ban fur sales and production. And it's about getting innovation to the point where if you really, really want it, you can have it, and it's not going to be the result of animal suffering. And I think we're close, and it's exciting to see it.
So your hope, I guess, then is that your job, you'll have to find another specialty that
Well, I think there's going to be
will live
plenty of
in.
opportunities on exotic skins, because
Yes,
that
that's true.
falls within the same sort of thing of like killing wildlife solely for their skins, crocodiles and pythons. And then you do see, part of the sustainability movement. A lot of these companies are being forced to disclose their environmental impacts, whether it's in Europe or California or New York. There's certain laws that are hopefully going to be passed that's going to, make sure these companies, if they want to sell if they want to have a high environmental impact, they're going to be taxed at a higher rate. And what that I think is going to do is it's going to show companies and consumers that leather is such a high impact for these companies on the environment, and they're going to have to start decreasing and transitioning to other materials. There's no other way, because it's almost night and day, or it's almost like, here's where leather environmental impact is, here's like everything else. And so it becomes glaringly obvious that companies are going to have to move away from leather at one point. And when it comes to down and wool, it's about the alternatives getting to a point where they're better. So I think companies are recognizing, especially with down, that it's probably almost a better material, some of the new innovations that are coming out, than actually using geese or duck feathers. And so I think wool's going to be a really difficult thing to tackle because I would say that the industry really promotes itself as sustainable and ethical and all those things.
Natural and
Yeah, and
good stuff.
the alternatives need to get there. We need the innovation to get to the point where wool becomes obsolete, and then we would maybe eventually get animals out of fashion because I think that would help. We can put our resources in other things, other ways that animals are being harmed and killed for us. But yeah,
Well, we have come, believe it or not, we've come to the end of what I promised you was the outside length of this interview. And I know we could go on some more, but this has been a really interesting look at 30 plus years in this kind of campaign. And it does seem that it's one that we are, as animal advocates, winning. And I know you've had a fair amount to do with that. So
yeah,
I want to thank you for that and thank you for your time. Is there
yeah. No,
anything else that we haven't touched on that you wanted to say or
no, I
before
guess
we?
the one thing is, I was lucky enough to be able to work on this at a really good time.
Mhm.
When I started in 2008, 2009, it wasn't looking good, and I think I was pretty depressed that we weren't going to be able to make much of an impact. But it is amazing how fast things can change when you have momentum on your side, and just the fact that like this issue going back to the 80s and 90s is you always have to tip your hat to the activists that have been working on this issue
Mhm.
for so long. I moved to Portland, Oregon after graduating from college, and I remember getting my first brochure outside of a furrier, Schumacher's Furs in downtown Portland, and seeing
Mhm.
what that industry looked like, and to know that I was going to like within a few years going to be working to end that trade full time for the good part of my career. It's just interesting. So the people that have been standing outside of stores and leafleting and doing all the things that are necessary to bring attention to how horrible this trade is I mean they are the reason that I was able to work on this issue and the reason that we were able to make a dent. So it's a really honor to work with the activist community and all these people that have been caring about these issues for so long.
Hmm.
And again, congratulations on 30.
Well, thank
That's
you.
awesome.
So maybe at our 40th anniversary, fur will be a thing of the past.
I
We
will be
can
all gray. I'll be all gray. And we will say that it is officially done. I can't wait.
Why don't we plan 10 years from now then? Another
Done.
conversation.
Send it to my calendar. We'll put it in there.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, PJ. I really appreciate your time and your work over many years. So
Thanks, B.
thank you, everybody. Bye.